Anyone got questions?
When I listen to you speak, I think, gosh, I love the art of newswriting too. Well, it's very evident that what you just said. It's not just about writing, is it? It's about pictures. And that's what's so interesting about it. I have to say, I found the Price-Hume story far more interesting. It must be something walked about me than Richard Byrd. And I have absolutely wanted to see more and more of the detail of her story come out. And actually, we got quite a bit more Hume in a way. The interesting thing about the clip you showed about her, the 20-second clip, which is, in a sense, there is no commentary on it, is that implicitly it has its own comment, because she was obviously she looked okay, didn't she? She was carrying a cup of coffee. She presents well enough. She looked almost relaxed. And yet there's this sort of undercurrent story about marital conversion.
Well, it's also, I didn't go into court reporting, but the whole thing about court reporting is it has to be a fair contemporaneous account of what happened that day, and it has qualified privilege. So actually it's almost like writing a sonnet. There are all these rules about what you can say, but and when they walk in and out, they're sort of aware they're walking into that scenario, so everything that will be said in court can appear kind of verbatim the next day. I couldn't go out and just say on the news, Chris Hume forced his wife to have an abortion, but I could say in print, Chris Hume, in quote marks, forced his wife to have an abortion. You can have that as a headline because it's a qualified reporting piece. So it's quite interesting kind of negotiating that terrain. But there's a whole issue certainly about what she told journalists and didn't. And I think another whole side is, try and control the news agenda at your peril, because they will turn on you. Take that one there and then that one, yes.
I wonder sometimes when there are omissions, like you said, about the two women's murders, do you think sometimes there's a tension between the short-term harm that's caused by that and potentially the long-term harm, where if you give so much exposure to these stories, which are, of course, awful incidents in themselves, but I think this also comes through when deaths from Afghanistan and Iraq, deaths of soldiers rather than civilians are reported. Do you not think that when people watch the news, if they see so many of these stories, it kind of blows the scale of it out of proportion to an extent that it changes society's view on things? So I also think the way that children these days act towards adults they don't know is perhaps unnatural because of the amount of exposure given to stories about children being abducted or attacked.
Right, there's a couple of things. So one is that the idea that the media stirs up fear about attacks and strange danger and all that. I have to say, as someone who remembers the 70s, it was really scary then too, and actually there were an awful lot of child abductions, and arguably people were more blasé about it, as the Jimmy Savile case has shown about child abuse. There is the whole thing, and you'll know this, Emma, as well, which is this idea that there's a notional scale, so one Brit is equivalent to 5 French people, or probably 10 French people, is equivalent to 500 Nigerians being massacred in, inter-religious sort of rioting in a remote town. I mean, I know that thinking. I have two things to say in response. One is, I don't think newspapers actually do sell the fear of violent crime. I think we underreport it. I really think that's my point I was trying to make. I actually did a lecture once and I looked at the murders just like within a 5-mile radius of my house. I live in a really affluent part of southwest London, and there'd been so many, someone who cut his wife up and stuck her in a fridge, and then got more time for preventing the burial than he did for the actual murder because he'd lost his temper and she'd been nagging him. And I think we underestimate how much violent crime there is. I think male editors and newsrooms have a real problem with crimes that they find actually quite horrific, and that means anything to do with women's bodies. So rape really freaks them out, and anything which is about violence against women in general. I think women, in a way, are more able to deal with it. The soldier thing is interesting. When I went to Channel 4 News after the invasion of Iraq, there was this period where we suddenly realised that the viewing figures were just dropping off, and they were dropping off because people were sick and tired of the Iraq war and casualties leading the news every day. This was after the war, when you had that sort of death toll started to build up of American and British soldiers being killed in insurgent attacks. Speaking of which, is the whole issue about the word Islamist versus militant, which I haven't had a chance to go into, but that's all disputed. And I think there's a concern that people just get bored particularly when it's soldiers, but also there could be a propaganda element of we play up our deaths in a way that is actually quite dangerous. That, you go and you interview the widow and you interview the bereaved parents, and you have the story of this wonderful person from, that town and, their fiancé and their child. But you're not looking at the big picture, which is what are we doing out there and how many people are dying and what purpose. If we're pulling out anyway, why are soldiers risking their lives now? That's a completely different concern about how reporting of a human story can actually mask a bigger political scandal. There was one more over there.
Yeah, in the wake of events last year, shall we say, basically, do you think broadcast news knows how to cover broadcast news?
You're talking about the Savile?
Yeah, and also the fallout of Newsnight.
Don't stop me. God, where to start? Journalists at the BBC are so angry. They are so angry that no one has actually been sacked over this. But Chris Patton, in another moment of foolishness, actually agreed to reveal all the email traffic that they examined for Pollard Review. So we think more people are going to be forced to go. No, the trouble has always been the BBC's managed by too many people. There are so many, but there's head of news, deputy head of newsroom, head of news programmes, head of radio news sequences. I couldn't finish the list but I know those jobs for a start, and half of them were saying. We actually tried to get Helen Bowden on Newswatch. We've been trying to get her on for the last 6 weeks, and we finally got an email saying, well, I was recused when the Savile inquiry was going on, so I can't say anything about it, and so I shouldn't say anything about it, even though her behaviour in the run-up to that is so relevant. The trouble is that in a lot of corporations, management, like with banks, like with many corporations, they live in another world from journalists just trying to get on with it. But I know a lot of the journalists involved in the Newsnight story, and they're very, very bitter. And if you turn the clock back, in summary, this is what the BBC could have done. They could have said, we can't run it now, but keep working on it and let's have a look at it again. They could have just parked it. That would have been the smartest thing. They could have just trusted their journalists a bit more. And Liz McKean, I know very well, which really surprised me. But also, if you just think, the BBC could have broken a story about one of their own stars, and there would have been a newspaper backlash in the first few weeks saying, BBC trashes much loved Jimmy Savile, which I think is what managers were thinking of. They were thinking really short term about reputation. But then, of course, in the long term, the BBC would have been an amazing place to have broken that story, because people know that the BBC can, report on its own. But of course that story ended up being obsessively about the management and not about all these abused children, none of whom have yet got any compensation. There are all these criminal cases pending. So, no, it's a mess. And that's as a freelance coming back into the BBC. I started out there. I feel grateful I'm a freelance, because if you're staff, people do feel they have to keep quiet sometimes. I think people say, look, all these managers are still there. They're still in their jobs, so you can't say anything about them while they're still there. Sorry, rather depressing note.